Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for coming. Hello and welcome to Foresight is 2020, a quick talk about pre-mortems, what they are, and how you can use them. My name is Will. I'm a software engineer at Stripe, but I'm actually going to save my introduction for just a couple minutes. For right now, I'd like everyone to lend me your imaginations. Whatever talk you're excited about hearing next, or whatever page you might be anticipating right now, imagine letting that go for the next couple of minutes. Empty your mind, close your eyes, and come with me on a journey into a disaster scenario. So imagine it's the middle of the night, the week before your biggest traffic day of the year. In your slumber, you toss and turn vehemently in your sleep from nightmare to nightmare. You think, RPS is rapidly plummeting during Black Friday. Oh my gosh, logs are truncated and pods are expiring. Why don't we have observability here? Let me see what this runbook says to do. Oh my gosh, this runbook is out of date. Why is our 10x engineer on vacation right now? Who do I page? And you rocket up in a frenzied state, hair tousled, muscles tensed, and heart rate a few clicks below its maximum. You think to yourself, we need to be better prepared. We need the lessons learned from an incident-post-mortem, but somehow before the incident occurs, like a pre-incident-post-mortem. And so thank you for allowing me to set the scene for today's talk. I want to take about the next 20 minutes talking to you about the value of retrospection. Whoops. In software development, we use the word retro to, we often use the word retro to look back on previous events, which are sometimes as benign as a sprint, but also could be things like incidents and outages in hopes of gleaning new insights for preventing future disasters. The value of such retros is often immense. We uncover holes in our observability, we identify preventative systems for future incidents, and we improve our overall software development process going forward. I'm sure many of you have been in such retrospective conversations and thought to yourselves, wow, I can't believe this didn't fail sooner, or how did we not have protection here? However, most of the time when we conduct a retro, we do so well retroactively, in that our period of reflective thought is prescriptively preempted by some kind of event on which we want to reflect. The impact of such ordering is that our period of reflection is often shaped by the event that occurred. In cases of retros based on incidents, which we as an industry call post-mortems, we don't necessarily review the entire complex software system, but rather our conversation is scoped to the part of the system that failed, underperformed, or caused a disaster. It makes sense then that the scope of such post-mortems is then understandably chiseled, in that they are often used as a public explanation for why a software system failed, as well as steps to prevent future regressions. And it makes sense that we don't use them to identify potential pitfalls in the complex software system as a whole. But then it feels almost ironic that we wait for such ruinous scenarios to benefit from periods of reflection, when setting time aside for reviewing runbooks, incident response strategies, and overall disaster recovery protocols need not be relegated to that predetermined sequence. Let me perhaps express this thought in another way. The value of reflective thinking is not dependent on the order in which it occurs. Taking time regularly to review is valuable regardless of when it happens. And so in today's talk, I want to explore how we've taken this insight to heart at Stripe and how we've developed a framework for conducting these preemptive retrospectives, or what we call pre-mortems, in order to continually benefit our incident response. Now, I'm sure some of you hearing me say this, saying, oh, review your code and runbooks more often, are like, duh, of course that would be helpful. But it gets hard when software systems are complex and people are constantly busy. It's much easier to think about problems in hindsight after the incident has occurred than it is to try and think through all of the things that could go wrong. And for that reason, a pre-mortem might sound good on paper, but it's often hard to put into practice. And so while I also want to talk about what a pre-mortem is today, we're going to go through how we formalize the process at Stripe to turn that perhaps banal suggestion into actionable practice. Before I go any further, I appreciate your patience. Let me formally introduce myself. My name is Will Carhart. I'm a backend engineer on the API platform team at Stripe. As I'm sure you can see up here, I have a habit or a knack of changing my appearance often, and so that is indeed a picture of me, don't worry. The API platform team at Stripe is the platform team that is responsible for deploying and running the Stripe API. And like many teams that own production APIs, we've learned how important it is, how vital it is actually, to invest in our incident response protocols and how taxing it can be for incidents to occur without preparation. After all, the incidents will happen, and so it's really important to invest in our people. And speaking of our people, I'm accompanied here at LFI this week by two other fantastic engineers at Stripe who are also passionate about nerdy things like incidents. Bridget Lane, who will be giving a talk about how we've developed sustainable on-call practices at Stripe, and Jacob Scott, who will be on a panel tomorrow discussing lessons learned while adopting LFI techniques. So let's actually dive in. Here's what you can expect here today. First, I'm going to run through the general goals of what we would expect to come out of a pre-mortem. Then I'm going to talk about the minutia of how to actually run the exercise. And then I'll run through a real-life example of what it can look like in practice. So before we go any further, let's put a formal definition on this term I've been saying, pre-mortem. As I'm sure most of us are aware of, a post-mortem is an analysis conducted after a system failure. And so a pre-mortem is very similar. It's an exercise that imagines a potential system failure and then conducts an analysis on such to determine what could have been done to prevent or alleviate that failure. So now that we know what a pre-mortem is, let's think through what we would hope to get out of it. It's important to note that you can and have, and probably should have, differently shaped pre-mortems with different people and different outcomes. And so let's try to find maybe some general guidelines of what we're looking for out of an exercise like this. First, it might sound like there's an expectation that we're somehow going to be able to foresee every single failure mode and then come up or conjure a perfect preventative measure for every single failure mode. And honestly, if you're clairvoyant enough to do that, I'm assuming you've already made your billions off of GameStop, and you probably don't need pre-mortems to begin with. But for the rest of us, for the mere mortals in the room, let's put a focus on recovery rather than prevention. It will be nearly impossible to out-engineer every single failure mode in a complex software system, and so let's focus on a fast recovery when disaster does occur. This is not to say that we won't do our due diligence to prevent disaster, but rather a recognition that a lot of it may be out of our control. Secondly, let's think about who we would want in the room for this kind of an exercise. We'll probably want to scope our discussion to a specific set of software services, and so we should invite key team members from each facet of our system. For example, if you're running a standard CRUD web application, we'll probably want team members from each part of our company that works on that system. For example, maybe somebody from the database team, an API team, and whatever serves your front end. And finally, let's think about what we actually want to come out of this exercise. Ultimately, we want to feel confident that the software systems we own will behave how we expect them to. And we also want to be poised to act in the case of emergencies. So what does that mean when we look at pre-mortems? Well, we not only want to reflect on our incident response strategy, but we want to come up with an explicit set of action items that we can take in preparation for a big event in order to increase our confidence in our systems. This will look different for every team, but they could be as simple as updating runbooks or establishing a communication chain of command for big events. But the second piece here is a little bit less concrete, but maybe even more impactful. There's a ton of value in uncovering the differing consensus models of different engineers on our team. If we don't have a formal process for uncovering historical context, it makes it really difficult to unsilo those incident heroes, and it makes it really hard for us to then pass the torch and allow less engineers to take the helm in incidents. And it's important to note that there's no feasible way that we could see every single failure mode, and so we're not going to try and do that in this exercise. Great, so now let's actually break down what a pre-mortem looks like. We've broken this into a couple of steps that I'll get into, but before I break down each part or each component, let's get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way to set our team up for success. First, you're going to want to schedule a whole hour for this exercise. I know that might sound like a lot of time, but it'll give your team plenty of time to discuss everything in the exercise. And in the worst case scenario, you can always end early. Second, create a channel or room in whatever tool you use while you communicate at work. We use Slack at Stripe, but any similar tool will work. We'll go ahead and make a channel for our pre-mortem. This will be basically our discussion board for the exercise during our meeting. And finally, we'll want to assign roles. So pick one team member to be the discussion facilitator who will manage time during the exercise and guide us through the discussion topics. But it's important to note that the discussion will actually be led by the engineers on the team, and so the discussion facilitator is not necessarily a discussion lead. In addition, pick another team member to be a scribe and write down or take notes on everything that we talk about during the exercise. Great, so now we're set up for success. Let's actually step through what a pre-mortem exercise can look like. So at Stripe, we break this down into 4 parts. Step 1 is setting the scene. Step 2 is brainstorming. Step 3 is discussion. And step 4 is reflection. So step 1 is to set the scene. Once everyone has joined your virtual or in-person meeting, you should tell everyone to close their eyes, kind of like I did at the start of this talk, and read out loud maybe a little bit of prose that will set them up thinking about what a disaster scenario can look like. And I know that sounds really silly on paper, but it does kind of set your mind up to think about how certifiably not fun things could be if we don't review these sorts of things regularly. The second step is brainstorming. So once everyone's in your meeting, you're going to paste in some discussion prompts, or some, I just call them brainstorming prompts actually right now, into your Slack channel. And remember that we're conducting this exercise as if a disaster has already happened, and that's why these prompts are written in the past tense. And so the first one I have here is what went wrong, and the second one is how are we notified of issues with the system that we own. Note that you can and probably should modify these a little bit based on who was in your room at that time. Asking a question like what went wrong might be a little bit too broad for some teams, and so you'll have to use your best judgment. But this is a good starting point. So give everyone around 15 minutes to brainstorm and answer the prompts in threads in your Slack channel. At Stripe, where a lot of our team is remote, we like to turn off our cameras to indicate that we're brainstorming. In addition to coming up with answers to all the prompts, the other key component of this time is to upvote the responses that sound the most interesting. Given that we probably won't have time to discuss every single idea that people bring up, we'll want the individual engineers who are on the ground putting out these potential fires to be the ones telling us which discussions are the most pertinent. The most productive conversations will come from the team bottom up rather than from like a TPM or an EM bottom down. An easy way to do this in Slack is just to use emojis and react on the messages that sound the most interesting. So after about 15 minutes, the discussion facilitator will move us into the third step, which is kind of the meatiest portion of the exercise. It's the discussion. And this will take probably the latter 45 minutes of your exercise. We'll run through all of our brainstorm ideas and talk about how we would triage and resolve each in an incident scenario. So once everyone has returned to the meeting either virtually or in person, the discussion facilitator should kick off discussion based on the highest upvoted responses. And if you need a good way to have these discussions, you're welcome to have them however you want. But what we like to do at Stripe is follow the acronym DIRTY. And I apologize, there's not an emoji for dirt, so you're just going to have to live with a rock for this one. Looking through each of these letters, the D in DIRTY stands for detection. How was the issue detected, and was the issue detected? The I stands for impact. How did we determine the impact of the issue, and what customers were impacted? The R stands for resolution. How did we stop the bleeding for the issue? And note, I'm really careful here not to ask the question, how was the issue resolved? Because in most cases, a full resolution will take a long time. And even the definition of full resolution is a little bit, what does that mean? And so we really just want to focus on getting back on the right track and reducing the impact as fast as possible. The T stands for tools. What runbooks, observability tools, or other resources did we use to improve the state of the incident? Note that we're going to want to be really specific about what we're using in this case. Don't just say, oh, go look for this thing in Splunk. Like actually write out the query or the search, or point to the specific runbook where you found it. And finally, the Y in dirty stands for yell. We couldn't really fit communication in here, so you're just going to get yell. Who did you communicate the issue to? And did you communicate to external stakeholders? And how did you make that decision? So while your team is having this discussion, it's really important for your scribe to take notes. And that's why we've assigned that role to like a separate person who can focus on this during the exercise. When taking notes, you want to capture the general sentiment rather than the word-for-word dialogue. And you want to take note of potential improvements, sources of friction, and general sentiment around particular systems. And this, maybe this will strike a chord, but does somebody bring up or everyone know that an issue around a particular subsystem is going to cause a big problem? Everyone's like, oh, I hope this doesn't go down because we don't know what we're going to do with that. Write that kind of stuff down in the notes because that is super, super valuable information. So the last step of the exercise is reflection. And this step actually won't happen during that hour-long meeting. We want to reserve the face time that we have for everyone to the discussion where we have everyone synchronously, because that's kind of the expensive part. After the meeting is over, the discussion facilitator and the scribe will work together to parse through the notes and come up with 1, a conclusion, and 2, a list of action items. The conclusion is pretty straightforward. It just is kind of how the exercise went. It makes it really easy to publish it to like a mailing list or Slack. But the second part, the action items, is probably the most tangible piece of the whole exercise. You can run through the full discussion notes and notice times when anyone explicitly called out, like, this is an area for improvement, and then try and translate those sentiments into whatever tool you use for tracking work. At Stripe, we use Jira. I'm sure a lot of other people use Jira, but it's definitely not the only one. The hope is to come up with like an epic of reliability improvements that the team can divide and conquer quickly, especially in preparation for a big event. The last time we did this at Stripe, we had over 35 explicit tickets, like documentation updates, increasing the resolution of our observability, and patching gaps in runbooks. Okay, so I know that was a lot of talking, but I imagine that everyone could regurgitate everything on my slides, right? So everyone's an expert in pre-mortems now? No, I'm just kidding. I don't learn things at all until I've had at least one example, and usually not even then. And so let's run through a quick example of what this could look like in practice. So let me set the scene again a little bit. We've had success at Stripe running pre-mortems a couple of weeks before peak events. And peak events look different for every different software company. Some examples could be like a Taylor Swift ticket concert release for Ticketmaster, or it could be Prime Day for Amazon. A big one for Stripe is Black Friday. And so let's imagine that we're Stripe and we want to run a pre-mortem in order to prepare for Black Friday. And no, I'm going to be a little bit like intentionally vague about software architectures here just to keep the example simple. I don't want you to think that's how Stripe is organized. So let's, like I mentioned, let's run through our housekeeping items first. So you'll want to schedule a full hour here for the discussion. So I went ahead and put time on our team's calendar. I also invited some external stakeholders from teams that we depend on, so people like the database team or the latency team or whatever works at your company. Second, I went ahead and made a Slack channel. I called it Black Friday Pre-Mortem, and we're going to use this as our discussion board for the talk, and I invited everyone into the channel. So, and the last thing, of course, is to assign roles. So let's assume for this example that I'm the discussion facilitator and somebody else on our team is the scribe. So once everyone is in the pre-mortem meeting, I'll start by telling everyone to close their eyes, and I'll read a little bit of background to them, the same way I did at the start of this meeting. And then I'll paste in our 2 discussion prompts and give the team about 15 minutes to brainstorm their ideas in Slack threads. And once the 15 minutes are up, we can look at the first thread and see our responses. And since there are 22 replies in this thread, we're going to look for the ones that are the most upvoted to start with those. So let's look at this example here that Miko said. A database shard becomes overwhelmed. And you can see it's obviously very scary because it's got the ruh-roh emoji. So as the discussion facilitator, I'll give the floor to Miko. Because I'm not, even though I'm the discussion facilitator, I'm not leading the discussion. And so since she was the one that left the comment, she's going to explain what she meant by this. And Miko says that a database shard became overwhelmed and then was unable to continue processing requests. So now as a team, we're going to use the acronym DIRTY to run through a discussion about how this might have worked. So starting with the D in DIRTY for detection, Miko tells us that we were paged by the database team. That's how we were alerted of this issue occurring. For impact, the team kind of had a common consensus that in this type of scenario, the database team would initially give us a list of customers that they think are impacted by such a scenario. And similarly, the R for resolution, the database team would probably provide us with some sort of a failover shard or something that showed the unresolved database requests that we'd have to manually rectify, maybe with something like an ad hoc migration. There's lots of different ways that we could do that. The T for tools, we confirmed the impact calculations that the database team gave us by running our own queries that we found in our own runbooks. And note that in the actual exercise, we'd be really explicit about what these look like, but I've omitted them here for this example. And finally, communication. The team kind of also had a similar consensus that we should, obviously tell our EM about what's going on, but then also communicate with the IRM for the incident, who can then work on a coordinated response on proactive comms or whatever is necessary based on the impact. Great, so now let's actually look through what got written down and how this translates into the work that we're going to get out of it. So your scribe first writes down that we were alerted of this because we were paged by another team. And while that's not always a bad thing, one thing we could investigate is could we add observability so we can own this type of alerting in the future? Or in addition, could we speak with the database team so maybe perhaps like a lower threshold on alerting would have given us a heads up with this issue before the shard became overwhelmed. The second observation that the scribe wrote down is we had to manually reconfirm the database's impact calculations, and that's some duplicative work. And it's a little bit of a gray area here because a platform team that doesn't really know maybe how the data is being used across different shards is trying to accelerate incident response. But we, as the team that owns that data, will still have to kind of redo some of those calculations ourselves just to confirm. And so even though maybe we can't eliminate all of it, is there some way that we could add a dashboard or other observability here so we don't have to manually go get that information on our own? And finally, the last thing that the scribe wrote down for this specific piece of the conversation was, and I'm sure as many of you might have thought when I was saying this out loud, is manually touching production data during an incident is really not ideal. Even though it might be necessary in some scenarios, we want to avoid that as much as possible. And so the general sentiment here is, can we automate that process? Can we speak with the database team if they have a prior art for how we could reduce the human touch here? That just is like a really easy way to mess up. And so let's look at how, when we reflect on this, like the actual work that came out of these different ideas. And so there's two things I want to show. First, here's like maybe some sample JIRA tickets that could have been made. I'm actually not going to spend too much time on these because they're just creating detectors and setting up a conversation with the database team. We have another one maybe for the Splunk dashboard that we could set up, or another couple others for how we could run those data migrations. But these are, depend on the team, depending on what makes sense for your team. But the bigger thing I wanted to say is what happened in this retro is we perhaps brought on like a younger junior engineer, and they understood, oh my gosh, this is the consensus model of a senior engineer on the team for how to resolve these kinds of issues. And the reason we have to talk to the database team is because that information's in their purview, and that is not necessarily in mine. In addition, we develop a relationship with like the database team or the other teams I mentioned are like latency, and that's something that's really valuable, and it's hard to do if it's not pre-planned. And so if we take a second to just reflect on how this exercise went, I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope you can take it back to your teams and maybe take something away from it. But I also want to drive home that this is not necessarily the only way for you to be retrospective. It's just one pattern of doing so. And so I want to leave you with something I mentioned at the beginning, that the value of reflective thinking is not dependent on the order in which it occurs. But it's certainly a lot easier when there's just a meeting on the calendar to do it. And so that's about it. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thanks. And then here's a slide just on how to contact me and us. I'm not on Twitter, but I have a website that I keep kind of up to date. And yeah, if we have time for questions, I'm happy to answer them.